Melda Music is going to present the success of implementation of an antibiotic stewardship initiative and sepsis risk, the sepsis risk calculator at Platte Valley Medical Center. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Melda. I'm a neonatal nurse practitioner. I currently work at Greeley Hospital in Greeley for university, but I've spent many years at Platte Valley, and so this is a great success story. It all started in 2014. Next slide, please. When one of our NNPs recognized the inconsistency of practice between the providers, all neonatal nurse practitioners and pediatricians. And so she took that upon herself and took it to the special care working meeting where there was a lead NNP, pediatric representatives from both pediatrician groups that are at Platte and the perinatal administration and a neonatologist. So she worked with the neonatologist, Peter Hulak at the time, and developed a sepsis policy based on the 2010 and 2012 guidelines from the AAP and the CDC. And she developed this policy for 48-hour stay and postpartum for most well babies, and also included a sepsis workup and more frequent vital signs. Next slide, please. So with this protocol, there was 3 levels of screening criteria based on the recommendations from 2012, and they used this to determine the length of stay for the babies, whether they needed to go to the special care nursery or whether they needed to go to the floor. Most well babies went to the floor, but if they went to the floor, they had a CBC, they would have a blood culture, they would have more frequent signs, vital signs. And but the pediatricians were all on board, and so they approved it, and we went out and we did education for all the staff, and we decreased our antibiotic utilization rate by 58%, a big number. Next slide, please. So in 2016, this is when we joined the Colorado Antibiotic Stewardship Collaborative and Von Oxford, and that gave us some real data. We started collecting about the pediatricians, how often we were giving the antibiotics. We did retrospective studies, and in 2016 we all of a sudden had all these inconsistencies in practice. Why? We thought, oh no, what happened? We had a lot of providers. Each of the providers brought in their own way of treating, and the inconsistencies all came back. So we went again and we started doing education again. Next slide, please. And we developed, joined the Vermont Oxford and the CASC team again, and we chose a key diagram like Mary used before and a SMART aim, and we started developing a big change and process. How are we going to get our antibiotic utilization rate down again? So with administration support, the perinatal director support, perinatal administration support. Our neonatologist at the time was Sadie Huyen with her support. We had a pediatric champion, which was Don Dykes, and the NNP team, and then the nursing team, and also pharmacy. They all supported us, and we worked together to begin change. Next slide, please. So we educated everybody on our current sepsis policy, and we also took it to the pediatricians and said, you know, the pediatricians were ordering some 3 days, some 5 days, some 2 days. It just depended on how the baby was acting, but there was no consistency again. So we took those data collection points that we were looking at, and we took it back to the pediatric section meeting, and we also took best practice used from the CASC team. People like Mary Laird helped us define more evidence-based practice, and we came up with, you either stop antibiotics at 2 days or 7 days. So then it became more consistency, and that it was based on the blood culture and sometimes on the clinical appearance of the infant. But we decreased our antibiotic utilization rate again by 14% overall that year. Next slide. So this slide right here is kind of busy, but it kind of tells you our story. You can see at the beginning how high our antibiotic utilization rate was. And that's when we were admitting most of the babies based on if they had choreo, even if their placenta was positive, they might get treated for 7 days of antibiotics. And then after the guidelines were implemented, you could see where it starts to drop down. And we did really well. And then you can see in 2016 where it starts to go up again. And this is a time we joined Vaughn, and we really looked at how we were doing, and really focused on our sepsis protocol, and really worked on educating the staff, defining our key guidelines, our key diagrams, and what our aim was to decrease antibiotic usage when it didn't need it. And our length of stay, we even developed a hard stop for our antibiotics instead of just letting it go on. So it automatically at 48 hours, you had to decide whether does this baby really need antibiotics because it was going to stay, or you had to reorder it. So that was a really good thing. We also looked at our blood culture results, and we were doing a lot of blood culture and CBCs out on the floor. And so then that brings us to the sepsis calculator in 2018. And at that point right there, we saw that we still needed a change. And what could we do to make things better? And so the sepsis calculator, really, Mary defined the difference between the sepsis calculator and our stratification that we were using before. And the sepsis calculator is so much easier to use. So we started that. Next slide, please. And what we found is that it not only empowered the pediatricians and gave them a way to look at things and define things, but it also empowered our nursing staff because they were able to use their critical thinking skills, whether the baby was well appearing, equivocal, or critically ill. It helped us drive the care that we needed. If the babies were critically ill, they would go into the nursery and we would monitor them, and they're going to get into more of the sepsis calculator and how to use it later on in this talk. But it was just an excellent tool, and it was so easy for our team to use. It also gave the nurses an SBAR tool to communicate with the providers if they needed to. If the baby was clinically ill, they were able to use the color system to talk to the physicians, and that was a great tool as well. It also gave us an opportunity to develop some tools when for handoffs, so that would be passed on, so that the nurses would be able to watch that 24-hour period for the baby well appearing, equivocal, or critically ill if there were risk factors. So it ultimately led to that babies that needed antibiotics received antibiotics, and those that did not need antibiotics were not exposed, leading to a successful antibiotic stewardship quality improvement project. Next slide, please. So this is our very similar to the last slide that I showed you, run chart. But if you look down here at 2018 going on to 2019, and it continued to stay low, and the consistency of the group was so much better after the implementation of the sepsis calculator. It was easier to stratify, and it didn't get missed because nurses checked that off at when they were doing transition and when they were giving report to the next shift. Also, it also allowed for the pediatricians and the nurse practitioners to communicate what the sepsis calculator was and what this baby's risk factors were as well. So this was a great success story. The tools that we used are on the toolkit that Pam is going to go into, and I believe